So I want to touch on seed plants now as the last part of the chapter on fungi and plants conquering the land. Seed plants evolved later in the Paleozoic, and they have some extreme advantages over ferns and mosses in terms of their ability to move further and further into land, away from swampy, wet areas. So we need to remember that mosses are small because they don't have vascular tissue. They transport water by simple diffusion, for example. They can't transport photosynthesis products from one end to the other very well. They don't have vascular tissue. They also have swimming sperm, so they have to live in wet areas. Now, ferns have roots and xylem and phloem, and they can get as tall as a small tree. But they still have sperm that need to swim to the egg, so they need a moist environment for reproduction to occur. So if we look at this diagram, it's a really handy diagram to check out. So we see plant group, mosses, ferns, and seed plants, the major groups we're looking at. Sporophytes, remember the sporophyte generation, that's the diploid generation. In mosses, they're small and they're dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition, meaning they're plugged in, they don't photosynthesize on their own, they depend on the gametophyte plant to feed the sporophyte plant. It doesn't live that long, it dries out, releases its spores, and it's done. Here's an example of a moss then showing you the two generations. In ferns and other plants that are related to ferns, they have a gametophyte that's small, but it's free living. It can photosynthesize on its own. The sporophyte, however, is dominant, meaning it's big and it lives a long time. And so here we see a gametophyte. Down in there would be where the archegoni are that produce eggs. When the egg gets fertilized, it grows into a new sporophyte like we see here. Okay, now the seed plants we haven't really talked about yet. These include gymnosperms. Sperm means seed, okay, and gymno means naked. So these are the seed plants that don't have fruits. So they have seeds that lay in cones usually. Gymnosperms are often cone-producing plants. Not all of them, but most of them produce cones. And angiosperms, angio means container, seeds in a container. These are the plants that make flowers and fruits. So these are the two groups of seed plants. Their gametophytes are so small that they're usually microscopic. So what we see as we move up the cladogram from mosses to ferns to seed plants is gametophytes get smaller and smaller and smaller. And they're dependent on the sporophyte for nutrition. So you're very rarely going to ever see a flowering plant gametophyte, for example. And the sporophyte is the great big green plant that you would think of when you think of the plant. So here are gymnosperms. You can see there are pollen cones and female cones here, ovulate cones. You can see the flowering plant here as well. We'll talk about these groups a bit later. So seed plants include gymnosperms and angiosperms. They're sister group to ferns and other seedless vascular plants. So seedless plants, like I said, they all have swimming sperm, and that limits how far into a dry environment they can go. So during the Paleozoic, Pangea formed, this big continent that was like worldwide. And what happens when big continents form is the middle of those continents are pretty dry. So that was a selective pressure for adaptations to drier and drier environments. So we have ferns and mosses and things like that living in swampy areas, but seed plants are able to invade further into dry land. Not only that, but seed plants have lots of xylem. They make wood. Not all seed plants, but a lot of them make wood. They can get really tall because they have woody trunks that are strong, and that means their spores, or their seeds in this case, can get further away from the tree and they can spread even further. So they have adaptations that help them there as well. So seed plants have seeds. We've established that. That's kind of obvious. But they have other things as well. They have tiny gametophytes. They have ovules, which are related to seeds. We'll talk about ovules in a minute. And they produce pollen. All three of these words are kind of have some connections here. Pollen is essentially a gametophyte. and ovules become seeds when they mature. But we're going to talk about these terms here in a moment. These are terms that we should be familiar with. Okay, so the gametophytes of seed plants are typically microscopic. The gametophytes grow from spores, just like in all the other plants, but they're usually kept within the tissues of the plant that made the spore. So, for example, the female spore, called a megaspore, grows into a female gametophyte, a megagametophyte, if you want to use the technical term. And it stays inside the ovule, the developing seed. Okay? So gametophytes develop from spores that are retained within the tissues of the sporophyte. And the parent sporophyte protects and provides nutrients to that gametophyte. So, for example, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so let's say I have an ovule, which is a young seed. Ovules have an outer protective coating called the integument. I'm writing with a mouse here, so bear with me. Integument. And they're going to have inside a sporangium in here that makes a single spore. I'm not going to draw the sporangium, I'm just going to draw the spore. This is a female spore called a megaspore. Okay, megaspore. Now that megaspore is going to grow into a gametophyte, but that gametophyte stays inside this developing seed. Okay, so let's just say it grew from that spore. It stays in there and it makes an egg, and that egg gets fertilized, and now you have a baby plant inside of that seed. Okay? So that's what I mean by the gametophytes develop within tissues of the parent plant, the parent sporophyte. So an ovule, like I just drew, is basically a structure that produces a female gametophyte that makes an egg. And it's surrounded by sporophyte tissue. So tissue from the parent called the integument. So this red line I drew, let me go back here. This red stuff that I drew here, this is part of the parent plant, okay? And it made a spore, and that spore grew into a gametophyte inside of this protective structure called the integument. That integument eventually hardens up and becomes the seed coat. That's the hard outer part of the seed that I'm sure you're familiar with. Okay, so an ovule consists of an egg-producing female gametophyte surrounded by a protective layer of tissue called the integument. And a female gametophyte grew from a large megaspore, which is a female spore that was inside of that integument before. Now pollen grains grow from a microspore. That's the male spore. So one thing we see in seed plants that we don't see in most ferns is they have two kinds of spores, megaspores and microspores. Megaspores are big, they grow into female plants. Microspores are small, they grow into male gametophytes. So pollen grains develop from a haploid megaspore. They consist of a male gametophyte protected by a wall. So basically that sporopollenin wall I've talked about. We have a sporopollenin wall, and then inside you'll have a male gametophyte, which is often, there might be a few more cells than this, but a lot of times it's just about 2 cells big. One cell grows into a pollen tube. They call this the tube. Let me scratch that. They call this the tube cell. And this cell they call the generative cell. Generative. Okay, generative cell. And this cell eventually divides in half and becomes 2 sperm. And this structure grows into a pollen tube, which I'll explain more later. Okay, so we have pollen. Pollen is a male gametophyte, just a couple cells big. It can blow in the air, or it can be carried by bees or whatever. And let's say it goes from one pine tree to another pine tree. It blows in the wind. When pollen lands near the ovules, that's called pollination. That's different from fertilization. Fertilization is when sperm and egg meet. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from one plant to another. And in this case, pollen does not need water for transport, and the sperm don't even have flagella. They don't need water for transport for fertilization. So sperm do not need water. So what happens is, I'm just going to crudely draw this. So here's a pollen grain, right? And I said it had a tube cell and a generative cell, right? So we'll draw these two sperm that have come out of that generative cell. So let's say here's the ovule, okay? This tube cell grows into a tube, which I refer to as like a sperm elevator. It grows into a tube, and these sperm are transported down that tube to the ovule where the egg is. The egg's inside the ovule, and one of those sperm hopefully will fertilize that egg then. So pollen is like a little sperm airplane with a delivery mechanism called the pollen tube. The pollen tube grows to the egg, and then the sperm are transported down the cytoplasm of the pollen tube, and they're directed to the egg for fertilization. So no water is required for flowering plants or gymnosperms for fertilization. So just to give you an idea of all this, here's a fancy drawing showing you some of this stuff. So here's a pine cone, a female pine cone. There's the integument, which will become the outer part of the seed when it's all said and done. So this is this is an ovule right here. An ovule is a immature seed. Ovule, O-V-U-L-E. Sorry, I'm drawing with a mouse. And so there's a megaspore in there. It grows into a female gametophyte. The female gametophyte makes an egg in a little archegonium there, just like we would have seen in a fern, except this is just in a different structure. It's inside of this integument. The pollen grain lands in here, and it grows a pollen tube, and it deposits the sperm to the egg, and now that egg develops into an embryo. So you can see the embryo here. This is a baby pine tree inside of this structure, and the female gametophyte now is the food for that gametophyte. I'm sorry, is the food for that new baby sporophyte. So that baby pine tree feeds on the female gametophyte until it can photosynthesize on its own. And this integument is now called the seed coat. It's that hard protective coating outside of the seed. Okay, so that's what's happening here. So if you can think about the homologies here, this spore is just like a spore produced by a fern. This gametophyte is just like that little leafy gametophyte produced by the fern. And the sporophyte is the baby plant for the next generation. But in this case, it feeds on that female gametophyte. And the whole thing is inside of a protective seed coat. So gymnosperms are a pretty diverse group. They're a very abundant group. The most abundant group of gymnosperms are the conifers. Other plants that are in this group are cycads, which we see here, cycads, and ginkgo biloba. We have some of those on campus. Those are gymnosperms. They evolve before flowering plants, and they have ovules usually in cones, even little fleshy cones that look like berries like we see in juniper. But they have cones, and they don't have fruits. Okay? But then when we get to flowering plants, they evolve, and I'd like you to know this, flowering plants evolve in the Mesozoic. They first appear in the Cretaceous period, and around the same, just a little bit after mammals evolve, actually. So flowers are basically modified leaves, modified sporophylls, leaves that make seeds. So we'll pick up with the flowering parts in the next video, but we'll stop for now.